All right, thank you so much. That was a nice introduction. Yeah, I didn't even say anything yet. But thanks to Keva and everyone who organized this. This is lovely. If you haven't had the curry meatballs, they're bomb. But so I'm a scientist, kind of off-brand here in a lot of ways. But so I want to talk about a particular idea because we're supposed to be kind of discussing this future of climate change and this climate crisis and what's going on and the way we're sort of influencing the environment. But a lot of my work actually focuses on the way the environment has influenced us and the signatures of natural selection it's left in our genomes and how our diaspora and our migration has led to sort of the observable phenotypes that we kind of see everywhere, from curly hair to skin color to susceptibility to disease and so on. So I'm really going to focus on those ideas and try to bring them home and how they're connected. So the first, again, is how the environment has shaped our genomes. Here's a really beautiful image of someone in Tibet looking over the Himalayas. And one of the most kind of famous or celebrated sort of poster children for the way human genetic variation has influenced our genome is high elevation adaptation. This is sort of well known that there are many genetic mutations that have led to human beings being able to thrive at high altitude. So the Himalayas and the Andes are kind of two of those examples. We have also destroyed the Himalayas through ecotourism and kind of like colonial activities of mountaineering. And here there have been like 24,000 pounds of trash discovered on top of Chomolingma or Everest, and 4 bodies were removed from Everest this year alone. So the second question is, again, how we're shaping the environment. And I put up these 2 kind of really captivating images. One of them is a paper last year came out showing that Indonesian divers have evolved bigger spleens to hunt underwater because they've spent plenty of time in acute hypoxic environments, i.e. at depth. So a lot of these individuals can hold their breath for 10 minutes. I mean, imagine like your best Navy SEAL can only hold their breath for about 6 minutes. But we've also just completely destroyed the oceans at this point. We are in crisis mode. This is an image of an individual getting barreled in Bali, and you can see that there's millions of tons of plastic in the ocean, and it's very obvious here. So we learn a lot using genome sequencing technology about the way the environment has shaped our genomes, and people can spin out narratives that are based on adaptionism and evolution. One of the stories I told you here is true, and one of them's not. So do you guys want to take a guess? Because I just hoodwinked everyone in this room. But that's the point. The spleen, exactly. And so we have the opportunity to rewrite history, right? It's not that it's not true, right? It's in a lot of ways, like you can spin out a narrative based on data and sell it to a journal and they'll publish it. But that doesn't mean that the scientific findings behind it make it true. This scenario is very true. This scenario requires refinement over time. And we need to think about the ways that we write and rewrite history using genetic tools. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm Hawaiian, and we have a lovely saying in Hawaii, and it's Ika wa mamua ka wa mahope. It's one of my favorite olelo noiaus. These are sort of very famous quotes or polemical sayings, and it means that we're walking backwards into the future. It means that we're thinking about the consequences of things we've done in the past and how they affect us in the future. So something we've done in the past, like our diaspora, affects our susceptibility to disease today. That's like a defining feature of natural selection. It's pretty cool. And I love that because that's kind of the way I think about interpreting genetic data and understanding it in context of what it means to our susceptibility to disease and the way that we can sort of repatriate our history and refine our identity and strengthen our identity as Hawaiian people, as Indigenous people, etc. And a little background on me, I first kind of got into this through archaeology. I worked as an archaeologist, dirt under your nails kind of thing, swinging pickaxes, the whole nine. I was like I loved Indiana Jones as a kid. I was talking to my friends about this yesterday. But you don't realize that that's colonial until you're kind of far into it, right? And I had these experiences working at a plantation in Maryland, and I was working at a place where Frederick Douglass, probably one of the most famous Americans of all time, taught himself to read and write. And I was struggling with this idea. I'm like, man, here we are, like uncovering all this material culture, and we're repatriating some other community's history, right? Like, I'm not Black, but I had the privilege of doing that. So I was wrestling with those questions a lot. Then I went on to the NIH and I worked on something called Genome-wide association studies. Anybody ever heard of this? Put your hand up if you have. It's okay if you haven't. Okay, we got a few takers, all right. These are ways that we kind of understand the genetic mutations that we find in one population and connect it to disease. So if I sequence 10,000 people's genomes that have type 2 diabetes and 10,000 people that don't, and I only see a genetic mutation in the people that have type 2 diabetes, and it happens to be in a gene that's responsible for insulin production, then that means that there's a chance that it might be connected to metabolic disease, right? So we worked, on some really interesting projects there. We worked on a project in Ethiopia. I never actually got to go to Ethiopia. I got data from Ethiopia, which is problematic in a number of ways. But this project was really interesting, and it's called podoconiosis, or mossy foot syndrome. And what happens is that individuals who work in fields that have a lot of glass particulate develop elephantiasis or mossy foot syndrome, as you can see here. So it's like our genome, and only select certain people are creating immune system reactions to this because they have mutations in certain genes that predispose this kind of strange type of inflammation. This is the direct way in which we are interacting with the environment, and it's influencing our genome. And it was really cool to see that in a real manageable way. In grad school, I designed a bunch of algorithms to predict blood type from sequence data. And that was really interesting because one of the things we discovered was that there are people in certain places in the world, and namely the Yoruba population in Nigeria, that doesn't have the ABO gene, right? This is the most studied gene of all time. This is the poster child for human genetic variation, classic population genetics, and here we find a population that doesn't even have that gene, right? Which is crazy. My PI at the time didn't believe me. We had to go through a bunch of arguments. I had to prove it 10 different ways. And the reason why things like this keep happening, why we're able to discover things like that in the most studied gene of all time, is because the majority of genome sequencing studies have exclusively featured white people. So you can see how that's dangerous, because we're charting the future of predictive and preventative medicine, and it's only including one population of people. And that's problematic for a number of reasons. One of which is that all of the algorithms that are designed to predict and prevent disease are based on one population, so they don't work in other populations of people. That's why we were able to discover that mutation in ABO in an underrepresented minority population, because no one had looked there before. The Human Genome Reference is white, so everything you compare to it is biased. So we're kind of like emerging on this digital Jim Crow scenario that has been kind of brewing for the last decade. I've been very vocal about it, others have too. But one of the problems is it allows people to propagate just so stories. So has anyone ever heard of this before? So have you heard of the Jungle Book? Okay, so this guy, Rudyard Kipling, Roger, let's just call him Roger. He wrote this child's book, and he was trying to explain to his daughter, he would make up these stories like, why is the elephant's nose so long? Because an alligator tugged on it, and and it became, extended, you know. And these are what we call adaptionist narratives to describe like animal traits. Now, these two theorists, Stephen Jay Gould, who's a famous evolutionary biologist, and Richard Lewontin, also pretty famous guy, describe this as the motivation for rapid adaptionism. So this means like the story I told you about the spleen, that's a just so story, right? I just spun out a sexy evolutionary narrative and I tricked you. But this happens all the time. And people aren't really supporting that data in certain ways. They're not what we like to call functionally validating things. They're just making an inference based on a statistical correlation, but there's no causation behind it. And it's dangerous. One of those narratives is called the Thrifty gene hypothesis. This started in the 1950s. It was motivated by thinking about our Austronesian diaspora and how we, you know, identified all of these island nations in the Pacific Ocean. So this guy, Thor Heyerdahl, anybody heard of him? Okay, he's also problematic. But he had this idea that we came from the opposite direction. So that meaning we came from South America and went the other way, which is not what happened. We came out of Taiwan into the Bismarck Archipelago and then radiated into the Pacific that way, right? But you can prop up a narrative about what happened. So what we have here is a mutation. I have very little data, okay, guys? So don't worry. But so we have an active lifestyle, right? And we have a mutation that isn't very present within that population. As that active lifestyle experiences feast and famine cycles, it becomes more advantageous in certain populations of people. And then as we move into modernity or modern lifestyles, that gene creates susceptibility to disease, metabolic disease, namely, because these communities of people are really good at hypercaloric storage. So the idea was ancient Polynesians didn't have enough food on the boats. Only the people that could store calories were the ones that survived. And now that's why we have the highest rates of type 2 diabetes in the world. That is a just so story, and it's highly problematic. And recently, in 2015, a gene was discovered in Polynesia that looks like it has private genetic variation that's only found in oceanic communities. It was recently discovered in Guam as well. So this is a chart of all of these different genetic mutations that have been discovered in genes that are supposed to be the result of adaptation. So you can see the one highlighted here, CREBRF in the middle of the Pacific. You can see ABO there. Like, why do we even have blood types? Well, we have blood types because we've been exposed to a lot of different pathogens over our evolutionary history, and that has shaped our genomes, and nothing has claimed more lives in the entirety of hominid history than bacteria. We also have a number of other adaptions. You can see if you look at the Himalayas, you see two genes, EGL1, LN1, and EPAS1, or EPAS2. Another gene was discovered in the Greenlandic Inuit. So you get what I'm saying, right? You're creating, people are spinning out narratives on individual genes and mutations, and we don't know if they're true or not. We know that the stories sound good. We know that the data supports it, but they haven't been really connected in the correlation to causation kind of scenario, or like what we like to refer to as connecting genotype and phenotype. The observation of genetic variation and the phenotype, the physical thing that we can observe, right? So I'll talk a little bit more about this CREBRF gene because it was discovered in Polynesia and it's very interesting, and I'm currently working on a project about this. So variation in this gene has been found in people who are obese. They found what they're calling thrifty point mutations in this gene, okay? And they predispose to obesity. But this has never been seen before in the entirety of genetics or metabolic disease. It protects against type 2 diabetes. So this shatters everything we know about metabolic disease, right? There's a linear correlation between obesity and type 2 diabetes. So as one goes up, so does the other thing. You would never expect to see something that predisposes to obesity but protects against type 2 diabetes. Does that make sense? So So that's very interesting. And if you're big pharma, you're loving this right now. You're loving this as a potential idea or theme for therapeutics. But the just so story, the claim here is that the selective force that maintained this mutation in Polynesia is related to the scarcity of calories during our diaspora, which isn't true. If you talk to anybody that's involved in that community, even in Moana, they had a chicken and a pig on the boat, right? So, but anyways, the media loves that shit. So they go gangbusters and they come up with all these themes. This gene that may benefit sumo giants and how a powerful obesity gene helps Samoans conquer the Pacific. And it's just not true or realistic. Even though, like I said, we have some of the highest rates of type 2 diabetes in the world. This is just a look at some of that data and what it looks like, this is called a Manhattan plot. That's the mutation on that chromosome 5. These are the association study data. Protects against type 2 diabetes. And we know some other things about this gene, but one thing that really sticks out is that it's involved in inflammation. It's involved in something called the NRLP inflammasome pathway. And we'll get back to that and why that's important. But it's not found in any other population other than island people. So I wanted to connect the dots. I wanted to actually understand what this mutation is doing because it's a curious case. So how do we properly characterize what it does? My model kind of works like this. We interact with indigenous communities. We build relationships. We co-develop hypotheses and questions that have direct impact. We then sequence genomes, identify mutations, do our dating mining procedures, and then we introduce the mutation similar to like copy and pasting something using something called CRISPR-Cas9 genome editing. Anyone heard of that? It's been in the news quite a bit. And then we do functional readouts, right? So we test those cells. We expose them to things. We put them in different conditions. And we're using this tool, which is actually developed here at UCSD. It's called base editing. It's pretty cool. It's very cheap. It's affordable. It's reproducible. We were able to actually make this mutation in a cell line. So we designed the mutation. We reverse engineered it into a cell. And now the thing that's important is you can actually compare a cell line that has the mutation and a cell line that doesn't. So think about that as a case control experiment. It's a very powerful idea because we know that the cell line that we're comparing it to has everything is identical except that mutation. So we can isolate its function and see what it does. We can starve it from insulin. We can expose it to different drugs. We can look at metabolite patterns. We can do all kinds of things to generate data and see what's happening. And what we were kind of coming to the conclusion in here is that the mutation exists in Polynesia not because of our diaspora in the sense of voyaging. It exists in Polynesia because in the 18th century, we were exposed to a number of different pathogens. So from Cook to Cortez, we had a population collapse of 90%. That's why the mutation's at a higher frequency. That's why it's involved in inflammation, which is directly involved in the immune system. So the story is really the impact of colonialism on the genome. That's the real story. That's the real narrative that I'm trying to hoodwink my next journal with, right? So, but we actually have ways to think about how we repatriate our past using human genetic variation. For example, in 2011, individuals from Stanford were involved in a project in Puerto Rico, and they claimed that the Taino people were extinct, right? That even though the culture is very much present, they claimed that they couldn't find any signatures of this indigenous community and that so they definitely dropped the ball on that. Now, if we compare that to a follow-up paper in 2019, how they're talking about how ancient DNA can help recast colonial histories, that's a very different narrative, right? From the same population of people. I just wanted to kind of connect the dots with those two. Additionally, one thing that's highly problematic and really bothers me and stresses me out every day is that mutation that we talked about, that mutation has intellectual property behind it. Individuals at universities in Brown and University of Pittsburgh have filed an international patent claim attempting to patent intellectual property around the therapeutic uses of this genetic mutation. So that's no different than extracting coal, oil, cobalt, gold, diamonds, etc., right? This is extracting something that natural selection provided to that community and trying to make money off of it. But we don't do that. We're more interested in actually doing community-driven research. Here is a summit that we had in Ahipara, Aotearoa last year, where we had a number of people from a range of different disciplines come together and discuss what the priorities are for a lot of different Polynesian communities. And it was really awesome. And what we have been doing and working with the Moko Foundation is we've seen that this mutation probably exists in about 30% of Polynesian people. But when we look at professional rugby players that are Polynesian, we see it in 50%. So that's very interesting because that changes the whole narrative that we're trying to spin out. And I think that, and what people are calling it in Aotearoa is the tall, dark, and handsome gene. They're not calling it a thrifty gene. So it's a very interesting thing about that. And then just finally, who knows what we're going to discover in the future. Hopefully we come up with narratives, solutions, and ways that we use this information to benefit people and actually have an impact instead of just, extracting genetic information, trying to make drugs and people trying to make tenure. So finally, I just kind of wanted to leave it with this, is what I call the let the people come to you model. So in 1998, a number of individuals in Aotearoa, a Maori family by the name of the McLeods, reached out to the University of Auckland and they said, we have really high rates of gastric cancer in our family. We believe that it's inherited. It's inherited, and we want to know if we can kind of understand where it's coming from and what it is. This resulted in a very important study where a new cancer gene was discovered in this population that could be used to predict and prevent cancer in all populations of people. And these investigators actually included members of the community in the author lists in the paper that was published in Nature. So this is kind of like your best case scenario playbook where the community's happy, we discover something that has real impact. And this happened 20 years ago, so we don't have to do the colonial stuff. Finally, we've also put out our own playbook recently, myself and a number of my colleagues through the Summer Institute for Indigenous People in Genomics. We put out a paper thinking about the sort of enhancing ethical genomic research with Indigenous communities. And it starts with sovereignty and, respect. So I want to thank all of these people. And then finally, shameless plug here, I'm teaching this class coming up, and this is a poster for it. And it is on technology on the go, mobile methods for human biology. And we'll be talking about everything from bringing technology to the field, genome sequencing technology, mobile ultrasound, distributed algorithms for pandemic prediction, drones to deliver vaccines. We're not going to just talk about it from a technological determinist point of view. We're going to discuss what the ethical limitations of these things are as well. If anyone's interested in taking that or spreading the word, greatly appreciated. So thanks.